Imamura tells the story that while he was struggling with the script of The Insect Woman, he was sitting there drinking sake and, as was his habit, smoking a cigarette, and he suddenly noticed an insect of some kind endlessly circling his ashtray. And it was from there that the idea of the title came. The Japanese title, I should say, means Japanese entomology, the study of insects. By calling it, Japanese entomology, Nippon Konjuki, he's suggesting that the whole thing is about a study of insect-type behavior, and he's not making a direct parallel. He's not saying, look at this woman, isn't she like an insect? He's saying, aren't we all like insects? It begins with a shot of some kind of beetle crossing the terrain. Having a hard time, it reaches a slope and has to struggle to go up it. The film, we may have noticed, ends with exactly the same thing being performed by Hidari Sachiko, the protagonist of the film. She is the insect. The film has a very deliberate frame in that sense, and the first sequence is designed to prefigure the end, and the end is designed to refer back to or echo the beginning. Insects are ubiquitous, insects are survivors, insects are the things that grub around willy-nilly, no matter what we do. I mean, we can put down roach spray, we can do all kinds of things to bring them under control, but they carry on regardless. William Burroughs taught us years ago that after the nuclear holocaust hits, the one survivors on planet Earth will be the cockroaches, who will be impervious to the radiation fallout. The fact that Tomei is like an insect means that she's endlessly adaptable. She will play her part in the group as necessary, but broadly speaking, her own survival comes first. Nikatsu was very unhappy with Pigs and Battleships for a number of reasons, and they declined to give Imamura any more work for a bit. Exactly how long is a matter of dispute. He says 3 years. The record seems to suggest 2 years. But anyway, there was an enforced hiatus in his directing career after Pigs and Battleships. He does a number of things in that period. He writes some scripts. He does a play, returning to his first love, which was theatre, modern theatre. But he also went away and started studying social anthropology. And for him, this was a kind of revelation. Although he wants to identify passionately with the lower depths of society, and he wants to talk, he wants to feel that he's at one with, the riffraff at the bottom end of the social ladder in Japan. The fact is that he's not. That's not his background, and however easily he manages to fit in with such people, he actually comes from a rather privileged background, and inevitably there is a certain distance. I mean, it may be a distance he tries to minimize, but that distance frequently expresses itself in a kind of detachment. Well, what could be more natural than to start looking at the characters who are in the field that he's interested in with that kind of detachment? He doesn't make films about educated people having, sophisticated moral dilemmas. He talks about people struggling for survival. The side of Imamura that wants to deal with that, I think, is the rational scientific side, if you like. Obviously, fighting against it is the insect side, the side that is prepared to see and value the characters for their animal-like survival skills, their tenacity, their vigor, their energy, their refusal to be cowed by circumstances. Tomei in Insect Woman is the perfect example of this. She's rather different in the village from the way she is in the city, and when she goes back to the village, she doesn't behave as she did when she lived there. There's a constant process of change and adjustment. But it's not a psychological change. It's not to do with an evolution in her mentality. It's much more to do with a simple process of adjustment to changing circumstances, and that's pragmatism, essentially. I think that one of the things that Imamura finds fascinating and eternal and unchanging about Japan is its underlying earthiness, and that earthiness is as much spiritual as physical. I think you can see it all pretty clearly in the early parts of Insect Woman. I mean, these are villagers who have sex a lot, who fight a lot, who get dirty a lot, who do backbreaking labor a lot. And it's an important part of their life that they have some kind of spiritual background to it. It has all kinds of very primitive aspects of fetishism and totemism. I mean, there are these strange sculptures that are littering the interiors of the houses, which are presented in a very portentous way, actually, in the film. The way they're lit and shot suggests that there is something pretty strong going on in terms of the animism of this community. Because of the almost ethnographic way he looks at his characters, the way he sees the Japanese around him, and in particular the women around him, he tends to define them, at least in part, in terms of their sexual energy, their sexual activeness, their potential for sex. And so when Tomei comes to the big city, she's actually surprisingly well primed to adapt to the new life and to take control of it, to take control of her own destiny, which is precisely what she does. Tomei comes to Tokyo as a maid. Next thing you know, she's organizing this union. And next thing you know, she's in prostitution. I mean, this is go-getting achievement. This is pragmatic know-how at seeing how to get ahead in society. His characteristic defining structure is that of a cycle or a circle. Things begin and tend to end the same way, and there is a clear sense that people are not going to break out of the cycles that they're trapped in, that there are indeed natural cycles, the most natural of all being birth and death. 3 different generations of women in the film, by which I mean Tomei, her mother, and her daughter. He's stressing that these 3 women, although they have different lives because they live at different times and live in different environments, have many, many things in common, and they learn from each other in a certain sense. Tomei, is betrayed by her own daughter, for heaven's sake, who steals her lover. And Tomei is indeed a bit taken aback by it when it happens, but on reflection she realizes it means my daughter learnt well, she's just like me, I would have done the same thing if I were her age. However much they may fight each other, or however much they may resent each other, or try to break free from each other, ultimately what we can see is how much alike they are, in the sense that all 3 generations are, in a way, trapped within their own cycle. Maybe there's a strand going on in this film, which is actually not much discussed, but which is quite a relevant one, I think, that the freeze frames are part of it, the randomness of the freeze frames, the fact that the freeze frames are so resolutely not iconic. I mean, they're the polar opposite of, for example, the final shot in 400 Blows, where, the boy Antoine Douanel has reached the sea and stares at us, and the shot, held forever and ever, seems to be deliberately asking us all kinds of questions. What Imamura does is freeze at a seemingly random point. Often the composition is shot to hell. Often the image is not even in focus. It's kind of blurred because of movement. So these images are anything but iconic. They're sort of deliberately random images, and you're being told, I think, by the director, don't invest any great meaning in this image. It's just a freeze frame. So it leaves you to figure things out a bit. I mean, leaves you with a deliberately engineered sense of uncertainty. Now, there is a side of the movie that is pretentious, I think, in a way that most Imamura films are not pretentious. It's to do with that balance between what you might call the earthy, sexual, the history of Tomei and her mother and her daughter, and the way that they form some kind of continuum through Japanese society, and the way that continuum mirrors certain larger social changes which are chronicled in the film's time captions and in other ways. Insect Woman is a social history. There was a migration from the countryside to the cities in the post-war years, because the cities, having, in some of the key ones anyway, notably Tokyo, been bombed to smithereens. The cities were, in the first place, highly anarchic. I mean, this is where the black markets thrived, grew up out of nowhere for the first time in Japan. And it's where the sex industry surfaced visibly for the first time in many, many decades. It's where economic opportunity was perceived to exist. You know, it was possible to get ahead in the rubble of the cities in a way that it certainly wasn't if you were stuck back in the village. So there was a social migration. That's the reason that Tomei makes the journey. This is the only time he attempted this larger historical panorama, covering quite so many decades and trying to span a larger social and economic history. I've always thought that his desire to look at 3 generations of women, each the daughter of the one before, across a historical spectrum, a rather precisely defined historical spectrum, from the countryside in the pre-war and wartime years through to the cities in the post-war years, was somehow a product of those years he spent not making films in Nikatsu, during which we've already said he started to study social anthropology. I think there is something of, the scientist in Imamura. He does his best to fight it, and he certainly has very strong countervailing impulses towards the irrational, the instinctive, the grotesque, the fantastic, the out of control, actually, the unbridled. Now, I think that the more willfully grotesque elements in this, all the sucking and the boil sucking and that kind of stuff, it's also evidence of a desire to be outre, to be scandalous, to be shocking, to be a bit disgusting. I think there's an element of attention-seeking here, completely understandable in my view, because he is struggling to define himself against a studio system which is increasingly hostile to him, and which, in fact, very soon afterwards he's going to leave. In a time of very rapid changes, social changes, cultural changes in the Japanese film business. The film, partly because of the central performance, partly because of the strength of the concept, is tremendously convincing and in many ways hugely impressive. And I'm not at all surprised that this was more than Pigs and Battleships. This was his breakthrough film internationally. This was the film that really kind of got him noticed. I also understand why he looked back at it from a later period in his life and defined it as being a film that kind of overreached itself, because it is different from his later films. He never essayed a structure like this again, and he never essayed a perspective like this again. He didn't try to have the kind of intellectual overlay. And although it covers a huge amount of characters and a huge span of time, I don't think anybody who watches the film from start to finish comes out of it scratching their heads thinking, what the hell was that all about? I mean, it's actually pretty straightforward, and the patterns of repetition from one generation to the next, pretty clear-cut, I would say. The central character is not difficult to follow. So the film is not riven with ambiguities and uncertainties. This is not, Last Year at Marienbad or something. It's not a film which makes you scratch your head thinking, what the hell was that? But there are those moments of confusion which do seem to be deliberately engineered by the director. And my guess, is that they somehow express, perhaps not directly but obliquely, his own hesitation about what he's doing here in terms of the pretensions to telling a big social history.